I'm Jim Thatcher. This is called The Individual That Data Can See, which is a project that is now out in Environment and Planning D, if you want to read about it in more detail or whatever. I think we're good. Okay, so you can follow me on Twitter, I guess, if you want. Basically, my research looks at recursive sets of relations between extremely large geospatial data sets and sort of how they come to mediate, saturate, and sustain late global capitalism. Most of this work falls into areas called critical data studies or digital political ecologies. I also do a lot of research on kind of I'm a geographer by training, although I'm in urban studies, and I do a lot of research on the history of radical geography in the 60s and 70s. So if that's of interest to you, like, the founding of Antipode and things like that, come and talk to me. All right, let's go. All right, so there's lots of definitions of big data, and they all come with blue photos of ones and zeros. And they usually come back to Laney 2001, which is the classic like 3 Vs. But what's forgotten in that is the second half, the demand's cost effective. What I'm trying to highlight there is that it's always a market orientation. But I'm talking about spatial big data, and here I mean the data we generate on our phones every day in our day-to-day lives. Just to kind of denude it for today. That's big data, right? There's 1.3 billion location-aware smartphones purchased in 2014. It's estimated that Axiom alone has 1,500 data points on every US citizen. And location advertising is the holy grail, right? This is why Waze was purchased for $1 billion. It's why Snapchat was valued at 25 billion. But it's also big science. Barry calls this the computational turn in social sciences. And we can find all these studies of Flickr photos, Yelp reviews, tweets. And the important point that I want to make here is not that this is bad research, because it's not. It's really good, and I like doing it. But when you use this data, you're fundamentally accepting that this data is rich, that it's meaningful, and that it can stand for and make a claim upon reality. So here's my definition of big data. It's about an epistemological orientation towards knowing the world, where ever larger data sets come to produce ever larger and more accurate results. It's not only what these data sets can tell us about the world, but also their intrinsic ontological relations with social, political, and economic interests. Sorry, no notes. I'll get some words wrong. Did I give myself, I doubled up on this slide for some reason. Cool. But that's like the critical data study stuff right there. All right, here's the empirics. Everybody else seems to be talking a lot about empirics. I dropped all of them in favor of this one slide, but they are actually underlying a lot of this data. And there's a bunch of articles, an NPR interview, an Atlantic interview, if you want to read more about this study. So how does all of this data that our phones give off every day come to be valued in the billions of dollars? It's an interesting question, and it's one that I kind of want to talk about. So on the one hand, it seems pretty simple to explain spatial big data as a commodity, right? Again, the valuation of Snapchat refused a buyout offer of $3 billion and is demanding a valuation at $35 billion, but they're only able to get 25. So it's not hard. But how does it happen? And I'm saying this data occurs in the end-user license agreement, which is a critical moment of commodification. For example, if you use Uber, when you agree to the terms of use of Uber, you are agreeing that they have a right to access your entire GPS locational history, every phone call you've ever made, and also your calendar with the new release. That's neat, huh? I mean, it's convenient, certainly. So these are just 2 examples of end-user license agreements. They're pretty standard. So the individual datum, though, like your data point that you were at the farmer's market yesterday, that's basically meaningless and also kind of valueless. It's ephemeral. But when that value gets extracted, when it gets captured, and when it gets tied to, say, the network of other users that you come in contact with, your historical trajectory of motion, who you match with on Tinder, that is where value emerges, because that represents an ability to make a calculated prediction on consumption, to smooth the nature of purchasing habits. So I call this part of capitalism's corporeal corkscrewing inwards. As previously private times, for example, dinner, where you go for dinner, spaces, and actions, for example, who you go on a date with, become represented in quantified representations of self. Let me see what my notes say. It turns out I do actually need them, for which I apologize. So end users generate spatial data through mobile device use. Corporations and governments dispossess individuals of their data through end user license agreements. Value emerges when datums are combined and leveraged together. This produces an algorithmic sorting of individuals. This is what I call the epistemological leap of big data, where we go from those 1,500 data points that you've generated into standing for you, into representing you as the individual that capital can see. So this is always an ethical question. This makes spatial big data both ontological and epistemological for researchers. It's both what can be known and what can be done. And again, I am not saying that we should not do this research. I do it myself. But what I am saying is that it is always an ethical question. And it's one that we have to take seriously before we basically cede into the hands of these large corporate interests that this comes to stand for us, before we accept that data that is presented to us as ourselves. Okay, sorry for being a little scattered.